Thank you all for coming. At least a couple of you are going to have a nice little napping time in the beginning of this as we cover some stuff that you definitely know. But I want to get everybody on the same page as we get through it. I love scales, so I'm extremely happy to be here and to be talking to you. Y'all aren't really here to learn about me, but just in case, I'm Benny. I have been in open source or around open source for what I think of as a long time, but I know that my view is going to be very centered on my experiences. And like I said before, a lot of you know and have been around in open source longer than I have. So if you have counterexamples or other ideas or anything like that that you want to share about what I'm saying, feel free to speak up. There's no ego for me in this talk, so absolutely. I also promised a bunch of information, and we're going to do the best we can with the time we've got. If I don't cover something or if we don't have time to get to your question, I will be at the Linux booth for the rest of the weekend, so you can come say hi to me there. The first thing we're going to talk about, and the thing that's been getting a lot of confusion lately, is the definition of open source. Specifically, we're going to talk about open source licensing, but I'll warn you, I go extremely high level. Like, this is not like deep philosophical conversation sort of time. If you want a deeper look, there are lots of talks, lots of videos, lots of conversations, lots of articles that you can find on the internet that are great, and we'll cover them in depth. We'll cover that topic in depth. But the thing that we need to start with is that calling a collection of code open source requires that it be released under an open source license. And open source actually has a definition and a specific meaning. While there are more than 100 licenses, open source licenses, that are available for use, these are the most popular. If you're here, it is very likely that you have seen or interacted with at least one of these. You probably are intimately familiar with more than one of them. These licenses collectively are used by about 60%, more than 60% of the open source projects on the planet, making them obviously the most common. These licenses can be split into two high-level groups, permissive and copyleft. Copyleft, among other things, generally requires that the person who is consuming the code and potentially redistributing it retains the license of the code that they're using. Permissive license gives a lot more freedom to the developers who modify the code. This is high level, again, like I said. The list of things not open source could be very expansive, but it is essentially this one, right? Anything that's not approved by, not an OSI approved license. Who is the OSI, you ask? I guess there's also this one, right? Like, all of the source available licenses don't qualify as open source. For nearly 30 years, the Open Source Initiative has been responsible for championing and guarding the definition of open source. Founded in 1998, they've been the stewards of and protectors of that definition, and they've acted as the final authority for that definition. To quote from their website, the open source label was actually created at a meeting in February of 1998, and it was actually shortly after the announcement where the code for Netscape was released, which is hilarious to me, because I remember Netscape that I used in middle school. After that founding session, they wrote the first version, or like at that session actually, they wrote the first definition of the open source, like the open source definition, which was actually originally derived from the Debian free software guidelines. And it was later slightly expanded. So the version that we use now is actually from 2004. As I said before, open source doesn't mean just access to the code. It also includes a list of guidelines around distribution of that code. Any of the open source initiative approved licenses will allow software to be freely used, modified, shared, and shared while maintaining general neutrality and without discrimination. Though you might not think so, that list actually allows for a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility, which is why we have over 100 licenses that you can choose from. If you are a weirdo and you want to go take a look, you can just read through even just the summaries of all of those licenses. It is many cups of coffee, many notes that you might take. The biggest reason that the definition of open source is getting a little bit confused right now is number 5 and 6, this no discrimination part. The lack of discrimination for me is both idealistic, but also key to what open source has done. The fight that they had in that meeting in 1998 was, how do we define what is or is not okay when we are all going to disagree about who should be allowed to use our software? Everything from, we as humans are divisive. We discriminate on a regular basis, everything from religion to Vim versus Emacs, which is basically the same, which everything from tabs and spaces, right? Everything from who makes rainbow cakes or who makes bombs. Everything from who makes money off of their code to who doesn't make money off of their code. Everything from who puts their tea bag in the cup before you pour the water on it, and those who are monsters. The key part here is that if we start to discriminate about who can use the software in our licenses, it no longer meets the definition of open source. No matter what we agree or disagree on, I don't get to decide that you do or do not get to use my code once it is released under an open source license. Having such a strict definition here is part of the reason that open source software has seen so much success. And that also means that open source software can be used all over the place, right? There is no industry that has not been touched by open source software in some way. There's no industry that hasn't benefited from open source software in some way. And that is incredible to think about, especially thinking about where it came from 30 years ago, right? It also means that it can be created in all of these places. And that is, for me, both the source of excitement around open source, because all of these different perspectives can come together, and also my concern as I decide as a contributor, and as I advise other people who are contributors, how to put their time, how to spend their time, how to get involved in an open source project that they care about. So let's get to the evaluation part, right? For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that you have generally decided about a lot of things, because it is impossible to cover everything in one talk. I'm going to assume that you have generally chosen what communication language you want to use, like English for me, what programming language you like or don't like, where you want to put your effort in terms of technology, where you want to, anything about general open source contribution guidelines. I'm going to assume you know most of that. And you're here trying to figure out how to evaluate a project for yourself. Evaluating that project and whittling down that list is where we're going to focus. I do feel like I would be letting folks down if I didn't also cover a couple of things that I don't see covered in a lot of the guides. Deciding, these two things actually get glossed over a lot, because we as longtime contributors are the ones doing the talking, and we ignore these things. We forget about them a lot. Even those who have been in open source a really long time really need this reminder. Number one, it does not matter where you are or what you're doing, your time is valuable. And recognizing that your time has worth means that you will pay attention to how much you commit to and how much you are giving to a open source project. It is like a currency that can be spent, but like a currency, it is very limited. It doesn't matter who you are, when you enter a project with the best intentions, you almost always go through this cycle. You get excited, you overcommit, you feel bad, and then you have to exit, or overwork yourself, or the dreaded burnout, right? You have to set expectations for yourself and with the project so that you are not overspending. No matter what, you're going to have a problem. Do we want to take questions in the middle?
That's up to you.
Yeah, I'd be fine with it. Hang on one second. He's going to bring...
Yeah, I can bring the mic, or you can repeat the question.
OK, let's just do a repeat. Go ahead.
Why are you going to call me out like that?
For the recording, he said, why are you going to call me out like that? Calling myself out first, friend, I promise you. When you make promises to the project, make sure that you're making promises that feel like they are not going to be too much, but also aren't. You have to be honest with yourself. Even if the work feels easy, like, oh, I've written a code of conduct 20 times, I know how to do this. It's still work, right? It's still going to take up time. I'm going to assume here, too, that if you're at this conference especially, even though we all come from different backgrounds, you agree with me that all of those backgrounds are worthwhile, and coming together makes open source better. All of those different backgrounds and perspectives, when we pool our energy and pool our effort and pool our input, everything is better. It's a fantastic way, too, I'm sure you would agree, for people to get some real-world coding experience, some collaboration experience, some experience finding a community and building relationships with people that you don't necessarily see every day. Hopefully they're like-minded folks, but even if they're not, that is good experience. Working with people that are not exactly like you or from the same place that you are can help. And it's also a great way for me as an old person to give back to something that I care about. In all of those cases, like I said, being intentional about where you put your time and energy is really important. And that, coupled with this, is where things start to get a bit muddy. I'm hilarious, aren't I? Like, come on. If you aren't at this stage yet, then I'm going to recommend reading some guides. There are a million of them on the internet. Go find some. Literally, a quick internet search, you're going to get a bunch. I found this one. It was literally the first one in my search results. But when you go do that, read no less than 5. If all 5 of those say the exact same thing, we know where they came from. Just find some that have different opinions, right? But there's one thing that I very rarely see addressed in these guides: money. It doesn't matter where the code is stored, who is working on it, how idealistic we want to be about the software that we're building, the code that we're writing. Someone has to buy the hardware. Somebody has to pay for the storage. Somebody has to pay for the bandwidth. It does not matter where you're collaborating. Something is going to require money at some point. You cannot produce software without money being involved. The definition of open source doesn't at all account for money. It doesn't talk about where your funding comes from. It doesn't talk about monetization. It doesn't talk about, how I'm going to pay my bills, right? But let's break it down. I fought with myself a bunch about how I was going to break this down. But I ultimately landed on this approach. I will say that I'm immediately excluding any of the, me and my 4 buddies got together and wrote something. I'm also immediately excluding any single-person projects. Frankly, because they don't fit into this format, and because funding those is very different from funding bigger projects. if you're looking at an open source project that is not a single person funding or not a small group funding, then they are either going to be generally corporate-backed or foundation-backed. Corporate-backed in this case means that there's a single company or organization that is producing this and stewarding the open source project. There are likely external contributors, but this company owns and controls it. Foundation-backed means that there's generally a nonprofit entity that is fiscally and morally responsible for stewarding the project, and that is ideally driven by the contributors' needs without commercial gain. For corporate-backed, we're going to think about some of the most common ones, right? WordPress, Nginx, Chef. They all have corporations behind them that fund them primarily. And think about, whatever. I didn't mean to bring drama in, is what I'm saying, okay? Foundation can actually be broken down into two categories. There's the multi-project foundations, right? Like Apache and Eclipse and the Linux Foundation. Those foundations house many projects underneath them, and those projects may or may not compete, may or may not collaborate, may or may not even know each other exist, right? Those, especially in the Linux Foundation, that thing is so big that there's a real chance that they don't even know each other exists. The foundation-backed, you're going to think things like Rust, like GNOME. I'm going to put Alma Linux up there because it would feel silly to not do this talk and not be up there, but it also is hilarious to put us next to them. These are foundations that have many donors and many different groups collaborating, but are not, they are generally focused on one project, right? And I do want to pause here, because I am not at all trying to say one is better than the other. I don't want to tell you one is good or evil. I don't want to tell you one is right or wrong, because that's what we're here to decide. What you're here to decide, or what you're here to get, is the tools to decide for yourself, whatever feels good for you. Each of these structures has their own motivations, their own drawbacks. Each of these structures will either make you feel comfortable or not comfortable. I'm not going to judge you finding your comfort, period. It's important for you to know what you want and how you want to participate in open source. Generally, a corporate-backed project means that you, as a consumer of that project, or a contributor to that project, can be fairly sure that it has a solid financial backing, because the people that are involved in that project most commonly are also earning a paycheck. So it is worthwhile for them to make sure that that project continues to be something that their customers want. But it also means that they have customers, and the desires of their customers might conflict with the desires of their community. There will be external contributors likely, and those contributors might have different ideas about what the project could do or should do, and it might cause contention. But it also means that, it also means that they're likely to have a marketing and or developer relations function, which means that you're going to have like contributor guides. You're going to have things like, badges. You're going to have things that when there's a corporation behind it, they can really feed into all of the community stuff that makes it really good and feel good to contribute there. What was your question? Oh, yeah. Yeah. The comment is that the corporations can lose interest. Yeah. And they can pivot, for sure. Absolutely. And that's, realistically, those are both things that are driven by the fact that their funding comes from the corporation, right? And they have to feed their customers, right? Foundation-backed, you can be much more certain that what they are doing is exactly what their community wants them to do. Because theoretically, the people that are controlling the project are going to be responsible to the community. Or they're going to be the people that are in there doing the work, right? The foundations, most of them, will be a nonprofit and voluntarily staffed. And that means that things like contributor guides are harder to find. It can be a lot harder to find documentation, to find guides of any kind. And it can be sometimes like walking into a room of absolute chaos. And I'm going to say, if you haven't seen Community, this scene alone makes the whole series worth it, honestly. Programmers don't like to write documentation, by and large. Finding free documentation writers is very hard. You might have to enter the chat of a project that you care about and say, hi, I identified a problem. I'd like to help fix it. How do I do that? It might be that this chaos is extremely off-putting to you, and that's okay. This is one more thing that plays into you deciding where to put your effort, where to put your time, right? I promise it's not normally really on fire. It might feel like it sometimes, but it's not actually on fire. The places that can feel most chaotic are also almost always the places that can use the most help, the places where you can have the most impact. Because if there is no contributor guide, and you come in and say, I would like to help write a contributor guide, the folks in that project, by and large, will say, yes, please. I would love that. And that kind of involvement in a project can have more impact than you could possibly understand, because the people who are looking for that guide before they contribute to a project will now be able to have it, right? Things might be still kind of a mess, but it's worth it if you like that chaos, or turning that chaos into order. This is, ooh, I'm going to end so early. This is amazing. Okay, so anyway, I was going to say, this part of evaluating a project is huge. And if all else fails, make yourself a list of important factors about open source that matter to you, that you want to evaluate. Open source is for everyone, from my perspective, from all backgrounds, all perspectives, all places of origin. But if you're like me and want to weigh at least a little bit your morals as part of that decision, the easiest way to kind of gauge whether or not a project is going to meet with your decisions is to follow the money. Like I said, it does not matter which project you pick, there will always be money involved, without fail. Choosing to contribute to a corporate-backed project does not mean you're wrong. Choosing to, any more than choosing to contribute to a foundation-backed project makes you right. It's also important to say that both of these options can be used to obfuscate motivations. I have seen, like he was saying, I have seen multi-million-dollar companies build a project without any real intention of encouraging the project to grow, and then offloading that project to a foundation so that they get the kudos of having donated a project. I have seen companies start open source projects because they're really cool, and then take over the project by just contributing a bunch of engineers. It's often seen as a fault of the project, and is used as a reason to not contribute there sometimes. Because, well, that's just a front for this company. But if they're the ones showing up, doing the work, then that's what's going to happen. It can only be countered if other companies show up to contribute. Also look at who's leading the project. and how the governance works. These are the options I see most commonly, but also every organization has some kind of blend of these. For example, the Analytics Foundation is definitely a combination of the first two. We've got both an elected board and an appointed engineering steering committee. We've got definitely a duocracy where like the things that get done are the things that people show up to do, and the people who are most involved are the people who show up to do the work. The foundation or the founder-led one is not always bad, right? There are many projects that we have seen that have had passionate people behind it, but occasionally they become the BDFLs, right? What'd you say? There are many ways that things could go sideways if there's just one person that has all the control. But I have also seen foundation or founder-led projects where the person is self-aware enough to hand off control, where they say, you know what, I know that I'm human, and I don't want to be solely responsible for keeping this thing going for the next 15, 20 years. So I'm going to set up a structure so that it can outlive me. I'm going to wrap it up with a quote from a buddy of mine. It was at this tiny, tiny event over in Ohio, 2023. Open source is not a spectator sport. If you care about open source, find a way to get involved and help get your friends involved and help spread the word about projects that you care about. Open source has a lot of ideology attached to it, but the more people we get involved, the better, without fail. And if you're benefiting from open source, find a way to give back. Even if it's just, I always retweet them. Are we supposed to say retweet anymore? I don't think we're supposed to say retweet anymore. You know what I mean. If it's paying somebody to contribute to the project, that's one of my favorite ones, because if you are a company benefiting from an open source project and you have the ability to, just giving somebody 20 to 50% of their time to work on a project that you are benefiting from on a commercial basis can have a huge impact. It works best when we work together. Open source, without fail, will do better when there's more people involved. And that's it. Who's got questions? Oh, shameless plug. If you want to know more about Linux, scan the QR code.
Yep. Do we have questions? Give me a second here.
So I've seen open source projects that are essentially corporate sponsored, but they have the facade of being community run. Like they'll have a board that has 11 members and 6 of them by charter are appointed by the corporate sponsor. And effectively the corporation has control, but you will never see them, you will see them say we sponsor this project sometimes or equivalent to that, but they never say this is our project. They always express it in community terms, and it always makes me feel kind of squirrely, and I wonder if you have opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the evaluation process, right? It is absolutely human, I don't know what to say. There is absolutely a penchant for corporations to work hard to get the kudos for something without having to do the work, right? That's not new. And if there is a situation like that, then it feels very much like they're trying to get the kudos of saying we're sponsoring an open source project without giving up control, right? I guess, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that previous question.
Can you pull the mic closer to you?
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
So I just wanted to add to that to this discussion here of, for me, what I look at is the proof is in the pudding. So if,
Yeah.
they may have that set up, and you look at that and you go, okay, that's a red flag. But then you look, okay, how does the community work? What stuff is actually getting into the project? What's actually happening? And that's a really good indicator of kind of the kind of goals and interests of the corporations or whatever, that are involved in there. So.
Yeah, because on the other side of things, it can be, as a person who, especially this year, is going to be recruiting people to join our board, I know exactly how hard it can be to get people to be willing to be involved in open source leadership. So if you said 11 members, right? If there's a huge portion of a board that is just one company, it may be that they had problems getting people invested in the project. That's one of the challenges, right? I think we had a question up here, right?
I was looking at the list of all the recent Y Combinator companies, and there was something that said like license or model or something like that. And I noticed that over the years, more and more had the term open core.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Is that the same as the corporate version of open source?
I don't think I've seen open core not related to a corporate. I'm sure that there may be other people that have. Nope, Steven says no, so. Yeah, so in that situation, open core is, here's a open source version of the software. If you want all of these features that are not included in what we release, you have to pay for it. And this code is almost never, Stephen will correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never seen it also open sourced. Like this code that you're paying for is going to have to be paid for, and it's going to be closed source. I'm so glad you came.
The one example that I can think of is the brilliant game that Elasticsearch played. Because when they relicensed, what they did is they merged all of the advanced features that were under a different license into the tree, so it wasn't easy to separate it.
Yep.
But everything was public still, just only some of it was open source.
Yep.
Can I just sneak in with one comment there? I was actually, I'm a fan as much as you guys are, so I was walking through the hall, and one of the monitoring tools, I was stopped and talked to them, and she was saying how their open source, free downloadable is actually more feature-rich than their cloud version. So I don't know how long it will remain that way. They said, the cloud's relatively new for them, but it might be worth it if you're looking for a monitoring solution. Take a look at them.
Yeah, the other fun one was Docker. And the joy of that was it wasn't an open core game. So all the source code was available under an open source license. But if you just grabbed those free binaries, you could not use them in production. So you had to build your own. So again, there was value in giving the corporation money, because they were doing the build and the support and the rest of it. So you got to pay attention. Your statement was perfect. Follow the money.
Follow the money.
The other example of open core that I'm familiar with personally is I used to work at HashiCorp. I started there before the license change, and I left shortly after the license change. Draw your own conclusions from that. We had Vault under both an open source license under MPL, just like most of our stuff was, and there was also an enterprise version of Vault. And the usual line that was drawn between the open source version and the enterprise version was, more or less, will anybody but enterprises care about this feature? And so it was things like the open source version would do an HA cluster. The enterprise version would do DR failover between clusters, would do things like work with a hardware HSM. Things that, number one, things like working with an HSM meant that we had to spend a lot of money to buy HSMs to test with. So we wanted there to be funding for that if we were going to support that feature. But also there was the idea of, if you're running just one Vault cluster, you don't need DR. If you're going to be running multiple Vault clusters and you need support, then you're going to be paying for enterprise support anyway. The DR kind of comes for free with that.
Perfect. Okay. Any other questions, comments?